Howdy YouTube pards. This is Jack Spade here, coming to you from High Noon Leatherworks, where we're going to show you step by step how to create leather goods from patterns all the way to the finished product. Stay tuned. One of the first things we're going to accomplish here on the channel is we're going to make one of these 1800s style double loop holsters. This one happens to be my wife's, and it's got her shooting rig in it. And I think we'll probably make the one here on the channel, we'll probably make it black instead of brown. And stay tuned and we'll get busy. Howdy YouTube land. We're here to start this series on the 1800s double loop holster, and we're going to start with making a pattern. Some people use all different types of material to make patterns, paper grocery sacks, these inserts out of a 24 pack pop can or beer case, whatever. I prefer to use poster board that I buy at the dollar store. You can normally get 2 pieces of it for $1.50 a piece, so it's not expensive, and it's thick enough to where I mark all my patterns when I'm done. Like this one, when I'm finished, I'll mark it with the size of the holster, the type of holster it is, and I'll keep that. So I have a lot of patterns that I've made in the past, and if one of my buddies or somebody calls up and says, hey, I've got a Colt clone that's a 5.5 inch barrel, 45 Colt, can you make me a double loop holster out of it? I know I can go to my files and I can pull out that old pattern I had. I don't have to make the same pattern over and over and over again. So first thing I do is I like to start with the material or the piece that I'm going to make the pattern for. In this case, it's going to be a Colt clone or Colt. It's going to be 45 Colt. This is a non-firing, basically it's a BB gun that is identical to a Colt. The detail is pretty amazing. So you can use these, or they make little dummy guns out of plastic or where you can order those online. But I prefer to have the exact copy of the gun that I'm going to make, or the knife, whatever it is that I'm making the holster sheath for. I prefer to have the exact copy or the actual gun, especially when you get into carry guns, like a semi-automatic or something like that. I prefer to have the actual gun when all possible. So what I'll do is I'll start with this to make my pattern. I normally start with a pencil, then I go to a pen before I cut it out. You got to remember, always think in your mind ahead a little bit about, which way is this holster or sheath, or if it's going to fold, which direction is it going to fold in, because that'll determine which way that you lay your item out first. So I try to go through that in my mind and move that item around to where I feel comfortable. I'm going to have plenty of room before I start this pattern. Again, that's another reason why I use a pencil to start with, because I can always erase the lines or go from there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start roughly sketching this out, and I want to kind of use the side of the pencil as a guide on the item that I'm using. Um, kind of like so. I want to make sure, because that'll keep me a little bit, a quarter inch away or so from the item, and I'm going to add to that so we have plenty of room. But then paying attention to sights, like front sights, um, you want to make sure that these are easy to draw out of the holster, so you don't want the front sight catching, so you don't want that too tight. And then on the end here, I want to make sure that I have plenty of room, because I don't want the barrel sticking out of the end of the holster, obviously. So that kind of gives you a gauge there, how far you want that barrel to be from the end of the holster. And then I just draw it out. Always give a little extra there, because again, this is kind of a rough sketch. I can always come back and erase it or add to it. So what I've found over time, trial and error basically, is I like to add a little bit around my drawing. I first like to go where my pencil went around the front sight, and I like to straighten that up. So I like to put my straight edge right on top of the front sight, and then draw a straight line, and it can extend beyond your first line where you went around the top of the gun where the trigger was. But um, that gives me a good straight line where the holster is going to fold, so that I have a pretty good idea how much I want to measure from that line over. Give me my center where the gun's going to lay, which basically is the thickness here, right here. So I like to add, sometimes it depends on the holster, what type of holster it is, but I do like to add about 3/4 of an inch from my first initial line, and that's where I like to start. And I just move up about an inch, inch and a half at a time, and keep marking it at that 3/4 inch line. And you want to turn your straight edge or your ruler as you go, and that gives you a pretty good rounded once you connect the dots, so to speak. And then I like to go around, and I'm not going to cover up the trigger guard. There, I made a little mistake, I just erased that. So I'm going to come around the trigger guard and end about right there. And then I like to use different types of French curves, and I use large ones, small ones, medium sized. Just I've got all different sizes, but kind of gives me a good idea on circles, curves. I don't have to try to do everything freehand. Um, see if I can find one here that's pretty good for the bottom of the holster, because we kind of want that rounded. Most of the old 1800s especially double loops that you see. Um, the holster itself kind of is rounded at the bottom. Let me get you a picture real quick. The one that I made, well, this is actually a pattern that I got when I bought an actual 1800s double loop holster out in Dodge City, Kansas at an antique place I found. And I actually kind of made the pattern off of that original one so that I could have a good pattern to start with. But that gives you a good idea what I'm talking about, the way it rounds at the bottom. And then I want to keep this trigger guard cut down low right here. And that can come up to a point or a little rounded point right there. So I kind of like to use my French curves for that. Um, I can freehand a little bit also. It's not rocket science, you know, but you can always cut more off your pattern if you need to trim it a little more. And there's nothing wrong with taking your item and laying it back down and kind of getting an idea again where you're at as this comes around. Keeping in mind where it stopped on the way up to your trigger also. And again, you're using pencil right now, so it makes it real easy to erase and make changes. So there's our first, and again, you could have used a French curve of some sort to make those lines if you don't feel comfortable doing any of it by hand, freehand. Um, again, it's a trial and error type thing. Now I'll connect my dots that I made at 3/4 of an inch out. And that'll take me back down to the bottom where I started rounding it off with the French curve. So I don't know how well you can see that pattern, but you can tell that it's really coming together from the look of what I'm wanting on the holster itself. So with that in mind, take your item again. I'll lay it back down. I'll double check it again, make sure it's looking good as far as where I want it to come up to the trigger, where I want it to come up to the hammer. And then what I'll do is I'll put it right back on the lines that I drew, my first lines on the backbone of it back here, and I'll just roll it over to that line. And just keep rotating it, making sure it doesn't move. And then that'll give me an idea on the back side, if I draw that line again, how much room I'm going to need for that to fold over. So normally what I'll do is I can go between the first line that I drew and then go back on the second line that I just drew, find the center of that, and it looks like it to be about right at 3/4 of an inch, so 3/8 of an inch in the center. Then I'll take my straight edge, make a couple of marks in the center, and then I'll draw me a center mark. And then basically that's where it's going to fold over. Again, you want to make sure that there's plenty of room. So what I'll normally do is, at this point, I'll go ahead and I'll cover those lines with an ink pen if I feel comfortable with where I'm at here. And as I copy those or go over those, I like to press fairly hard so I kind of get an indentation in the poster board, especially when I get to the center line. So when I get up here and I'm about to the center line, I'll take my straight edge again, come over to the center line, and I'll press fairly hard with my ink pen to cover that line. And the reason I want to do that is then going to make kind of a natural folding mark or a folding area. It's going to make that fold fairly easy. So you'll notice it folds pretty well right on that center mark that I made. And at this point, I can take my item, I can lay it on the inside, and I can come around, and that gives me a really good idea whether I'm going to have enough material when I cut my leather or not. You can pretty much go by the pattern, because the leather is not super thick that I'm going to use, but so I can tell just by folding that over that I'm going to be fairly short on the amount of leather that I need. So I'm going to have to add, I added about 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to have to add a little more to the size of that in order to end up with enough right here when I sew that. So you want to make sure you have plenty. Again, you can always cut more excess off, but you can't add any. Once you've cut it, you've cut it. You know, the old adage, measure twice, cut once. So I'm going to add some more to that, make me feel a lot more comfortable, so that I don't end up with too small a piece of leather. So I think if I add another 1/2 inch to what I've already got, I think that'll be plenty. And again, I can always come back and test it, try it again. And I can do this as long as I don't cut my pattern material. I can do this as many times as I need to till I feel comfortable. And even up to the point where you've already cut the leather, you can make small adjustments to that. So I'll go ahead and again I'll connect the dots, and it basically just follows the same curvature, the same pattern that I had previously. It's just going to be a 1/2 inch larger at this point. Make sure that I do cut plenty of material. And then at that point I can go ahead and check it again. So flip it over, stick my item back in there again. I want that fold right in the center of that, because that's what's going to give me the best idea of how much room I have. And then I can just press that down. That gives me a pretty good idea of whether I'm going to have enough leather there to sew, and my items still fit in there nice and snug. I don't want them slipping out, sliding out. Um, it looks like I have a pretty good pattern started there, where I've got enough leather out here now on my pattern to where I'm not going to come up short on my leather. And that's the key. You don't want to come up short. You always trim a little off. So my next thing is I'm going to want to make sure that I leave enough material back here on this side of my poster board for the backing of my holster that I put my loops in. So this part back here, which you can see, here's the back side. We want to make sure we leave plenty of material, or pattern material, to make that. So we'll know how much of that we need after we fold this over, cut this out, and then we can fold the holster back, and that'll give us a good idea how much material we need in the back here. So I just want to cut this out so I can have this material still left. So you gotta be careful not to cut straight across, or you'll cut all your material off for your backing. So I'll take my knife, and I just use a utility knife again, following the ink lines that I put on here. Make sure you're always cutting away from yourself. Or away from your hand, I should say. So when I can turn it over, I can cut the center part where I rounded that. And then I can come back and follow the pattern again on the other side. So I folded it over in the center. And I'm just going to follow the pattern I cut on my line for the back side, where they're going to meet. And then what I want to do is I want to cut this excess off so I can actually get to folding this over. So I only need enough to go around the outside of my holster. So when I cut it off, as long as I cut off the top part away from my holster, that should give me plenty. And I always keep these because I can use these for patterns for other things. And then at that point, I can go ahead and fold this over. Depending on uh, whether you want it a little angled, uh, tilted forward, tilted back, straight up and down. Normally, on the old 1800s type holsters like these double loops, they were pretty much straight up and down most of the time. So you want to fold that over, get a good idea. Where that leather would fold over to put your belt through there. Now that I got that folded over, you can see it's pretty straight up and down. But now that I have that folded over, I can go ahead and do my outline here around the outside of the holster for my backing, where I'm going to put my loops. Again, you can use a pencil if you want. At this point, I'm just going to use the pen and measure. Probably go, oh, let's go 3/4 of an inch around. Like I said, if you want to, you can always take more off, but you can't add it back on. That's the bad part. So let's go 3/4 of an inch. And again, I'm just marking it every inch or so that I do the connect the dots. And then at the top, you can see on this one, it kind of comes up, just disappears underneath the point. On this side, it comes up and then starts rounding off toward the fold. So once you get this measured out, and kind of start figuring out how you want that to look. Whether you want that to go all the way around. Some of the old ones do go all the way around like that. But I kind of like the neater tucked in look. So I think that's how we'll do ours. We'll come up and kind of start tucking this in a little bit. Then I'll go back just like I did on the pattern for the actual holster, and I'll start connecting the dots. Again, this is not rocket science, as long as it's close, sketch them in, because when you cut it out, you can make some adjustments, and then when you get ready to use your pattern to cut out your leather, you can make some more adjustments. So it's not that critical at this point. there's what I come up with. So the next thing we need to do on the pattern is figure out where we want our loops. And that's kind of subjective. You want to definitely keep them far enough away from each other that they do serve their purpose to hold that holster in there, you know. So you don't want them too close together. Um, so maybe an inch and a half, 2 inches apart. Let me look and see what this old one was. It was an inch and a half, so that's plenty. And it looks like kind of an inch and a half from the bottom of the holster. So if we go an inch and a half, and then we make the actual loops 3/4 of an inch wide, and then go an inch and a half, and then 3/4 of an inch for the second loop. What that does is on this one, what it does is the top strap or the loop is going to be right underneath where our hammer or our trigger guard comes out, which is probably going to be pretty good. I mean, that's kind of a little high, um, but again, this is for I think that's a 5.5 inch barrel. So we'll try this. We'll see how it turns out. Again, we can always make adjustments. So I can draw my lines across my holster. Go ahead and let it hit the back. So go a little bit further than just on the top layer of your pattern so that it falls off of the top layer and hits the bottom so that you get a mark. And I'll show you what I'm talking about here in just a second. So I let it fall off the top so I can get my marks back here. What that does is that tells me how far I need to go, and I can just put a little cross mark. It tells me how far I need to go when I cut them. And gives me a little target there. I'll show you how I use those later. And I'll just draw an X where my straps go. So I know that's the area that my straps fall into. So I've got my X's here to show that's where my straps go across. Now I can go ahead and cut the rest of this out with my knife. I'm going to cut on the outside line that I just drew. Again, sorry if my hand's in the way, but I'm trying to make sure I don't ever cut toward my other hand. I do normally cut left-handed. I say normally because not always. Sometimes I cut with the other hand. And then what that does is that leaves you with your fold over here that you need to cut out. So I'm going to go ahead and continue that line. As you see, I just grabbed it with the right hand. And then the same way here, fold this out. I want to make sure I don't cut this off. Because that will be part of the leather right there. And again, I'll keep these extra pieces because even a small knife sheath or like this would be perfect for a cuff pattern. So I like to hang on to those. These little small pieces are really good for making bullet loops or bullet loop patterns. So as you can see, we've got our pattern now. And this is what it looks like. This is our holster. And then this is the backer. And then it actually has our loops shown on there too. So the next thing we'll need to do is go ahead and put this on our leather and cut out our leather next. So stay tuned for that episode.